Welcome to Great Power Politics. Today's lecture will be slightly different than our previous lectures. I will not use this opportunity to convey information to you, but rather to reiterate information we previously have discussed and use it to make predictions about possible scenarios for the future. So this combination about kind of reiterating our previous knowledge and linking it to future developments is at the core of this specific class. So I hope you will enjoy it, and I will go right into the slides. Thank you. Okay, what we are talking about today is really about the future of great power politics. And I want to make a synergy between what we have learned about the past and the individual components within this in the international system, and kind of bring them together into this kind of more comprehensive understanding of the future of great power politics. In a way, I won't convey a lot of more knowledge, as I said, and you shouldn't kind of see this as a traditional lecture as previously. I want to raise questions, and these kind of questions, hopefully we can discuss in class further and develop our own very own predictions and own expectations about the future of great power politics. So yeah, bear with me, and I will talk a little bit about theory in the beginning and then basically raise lots of questions, which I hope you can carry on with you into our class. If you're thinking about the key concepts back at the very beginning, about the key concepts of great power politics. And of course, at the very beginning, there was the anarchy of states. And so in a way, one of the problems of the international system is that there is no entity which can kind of monitor, control, or enforce any kind of conflict resolution and help states to basically kind of go along peacefully within the system. So this overarching entity is not existent, and that is problematic, because that means, and at the end of the day, that each country has to kind of find its own place in this international system, but also kind of defends this place individually, because otherwise it will not be cared for. And so if we make an analogy with a nation state, we see the key difference here, because a nation state has the ability to actually protect its citizens. The international system doesn't have the ability to protect the countries within the system, and therefore predominantly they are responsible, the countries are responsible for their own protection. Of course, this kind of creates this idea which we had in the beginning about a security dilemma, that and that basically there is an aim of countries to protect themselves and be strong as possible in order to be protected. At the same time, any kind of change in a country's security structure, its defense abilities, etc., will also kind of increase the threat level for other countries. And so we do have this situation that countries try to, or this the dilemma that countries try to protect themselves, but by doing so, they are threatening other countries as well. In a way, this kind of really got to the heart of this idea about politics, power politics, where the realist perspective is that countries need to help themselves, but at the same time, power is distributed, of course, unequally between countries. So countries are economically successful, more successful than others. Countries are bigger than others, countries have a military capability for whatever reason, which is different than other countries. And all these kind of factors create inequality within the international system. And this inequality, at least in respect of realist theory, kind of causes a hierarchy within the international system. So they're the most powerful and then the least powerful, and in between all the countries are ranked along a kind of a list, if you want to. And any kind of movements within this kind of the power structure, this kind of list, can cause problems. So if one country is getting up on the list and becoming more powerful, then of course others have to go down on this list. And that means that they are probably unhappy about the situation. So a big part of realist perspective here is really how to moderate this kind of list, how to kind of create a stability in the positions which avoid conflict, but at the same time kind of leaving the key concept that power is the most important factor and that kind of the power distribution is determining stability to keep this untouched. Other actors and other scholars were focusing on other parts in there and thinking about the international system as becoming more and more structured. And so they're kind of focusing on the idea about international organizations, also non-governmental organizations, other kind of entities which are beyond the level of an individual state, and kind of see how these kind of alliances as well, how they can kind of stabilize the situation in a world of fluctuating power, and kind of create some security at the one hand for the weaker countries, but at the other hand also some stability for the powerful countries. And they don't claim that power is not important. But they kind of think more about that there are structural solutions to avoid these kind of power traps. So if we kind of think about the form of state power and how that power states changes, is that state power is really kind of immanent in it. And so that the idea about state power is constantly changing. Not the idea is changing, but state power is actually constantly in fluctuation and changing. But at the same time, that the relations remain the same between the nation states. The nature of it remains the same. So we have these two different aspects. That on the one hand, power is changing, and the other, the relations are staying the same. And the idea here is that this kind of enables states to not be in a permanent or persistent conflict situation. So in the idea about, we do have basically three different categories maybe of powers which are playing a key role in this idea. And the first one and the highest one is maybe the kind of great powers. The idea behind them is that they are dominating the global politics and are relevant all over the world. So global powers are not just relevant in their region, but are kind of in any part in the world. They are important. They can be empires, they can be what is often called hegemons, or they can be something like what kenberry calls a liberal hegemon, so being maybe less enforcing their own power, but still kind of structuring the international system. So we do have different forms of great powers, but the key kind of ingredient, if you will, is that they are much more powerful than other countries, and that they are kind of their impact is felt all over the world. On the other hand, the next kind of category, which is often kind of taken, is the idea about middle powers. Middle powers are value of resources for great powers, but they're not in the same kind of league. They're not as strong as the great powers. However, they have a regional impact, and especially as allies, they're very important for the strategy of great powers. And you could think about this like countries like in Europe, France or Germany, but also Japan, etc., can be seen in this specific category. And then there are the smaller powers, the smaller powers. They are not as important for power balance effects. At the one hand, they're of course more insecure. So they have an interest in being affiliated. One is one of the middle powers or the great powers. But at the same time, they can also be a flashpoint of conflict and instability in a region, and therefore have an impact for great powers as well. So we do have these kind of different categories here, and they have a different function and also different needs and desires within the international system. And so this is really important to understand if we are kind of think about the specific actions countries are taking. The interesting part here is that theories don't make a distinction between other kind of features or factors of these kind of powers in terms of political system, economic system, region where they are located, etc. So it seems that these kind of the ideas are very much based on around this center of how powerful these specific entities are, and nothing else is really relevant. In a way, if we think about great power politics and the nature of it, we can always see about stability, so the status quo versus change of the political system. If we have a stability in the political, in the international system, then the dynamics are different than if there is if there's change in the international system. So this kind of this notion between status quo versus change is really important, because a lot of theories predict that instability is caused by change in the international system. So if countries become more powerful or less powerful, especially if we talk about great powers, then this is a situation of uncertainty, and this kind of uncertainty translates into instability. If you think about the tools, what the kind of is used in understanding great power politics, basically the most important here is national power. National power is at the core of it, and from a realist perspective, is really the only essence of it. However, liberalists, but also realists in some parts, think about the forms of alliances and kind of joining groups. Diplomacy in the realm of kind of conflict resolution is an important factor there. And then especially the structure of the international system. So we do have realists, which really kind of Waltz and others, which focus on the structure of the hierarchy in terms of, or the balance structure. And then we have other scholars like Kenberry, who are thinking about the international system in a more broader terms, like especially in the recent system, about built by the United States, and being liberal at the one time, but also kind of built by this hegemon. In a way, often it is said that great powers seek universal empires, but it is important to see that these kind of empires are not necessarily identical, and that the philosophies behind them is very different. They can be based on pure exploitation, they can be based on mutual existence, or they can be based on a kind of common understanding like the international liberal system. What we do see, and that's why it is important to think about these kind of forms of empire, is that these great powers can struggle if a supplanter is challenging their position. And we have seen this with France and the UK, with the USSR, the Soviet Union, and the United States during the Cold War. And maybe at the moment we see the beginning of it with the United States and China. These kind of situations of challenges in the international system lead to extended volatility of the system at the one hand, but on the other hand, also to the increased risk of conflict and even military conflict. So we have to be wary of them, and that is also one of the reasons why lots of attention is paid to this. Lots of the attention is paid. So the potential of conflict in this kind of specific power struggles is extremely high. So lots of focus on research lots of research is focused on this idea about great power struggle between an incumbent and the supplanted power. And lots of attention is paid to this, but rightfully, because it seems that these are the most volatile times, and we might actually just have entered a new one like this. Then, of course, this kind of brings us then back to this idea about balancing of power, and in a way, it's the understanding is kind of there's a colloquial understanding which is maybe quite universal. But if you kind of look at the development of this in the research and from a historical perspective, there are quite some differences. And so, in a way, historically, balance of power is seen as this kind of function of a system equilibrium. Not necessarily that this is a conscious policy that countries try to actually build a power balance, but rather that this is a situation, an equilibrium situation, which kind of is kind of developed over time within the international system, rather than something which is kind of done consciously. Liberal kind of thoughts are quite a bit different. They are kind of acknowledging that there are self-interests which kind of develop these equilibrium situations, and kind of are founded on the principles of states and their kind of common understanding what a nation state is and what their rights are. But they're also kind of this kind of equilibriums are consciously used, and balancing is consciously used to limit conflict and eventually maybe overcome it and kind of overcome the risk of wars. And that is very important, that the notion in liberal thoughts, the notion of balancing is seen as a kind of not just something which happens, but which is kind of consciously aimed for, and that the international system should reflect this form of power balance. For example, say in international institutions like the United Nations, etc. And then the realists, again, have a different, maybe a Machiavellian kind of idea about balance of power. And that kind of goes back to this idea about states only have permanent interests. And this is that they have the highest possible power position. So in a way, they are really relevant because they are, their drive is not necessarily to balance, but their drive is to increase their power position. But they realists then see that power balance is inherently unstable at the one hand, but at the other hand also that it's used strategically by countries if beneficial for them, but kind of left if it's not beneficial of them anymore. So the strategic component is really important from the realist perspective. So we can kind of we can move on from this. Sorry about that. From this this idea about balancing to the idea about hegemonic power. And so something which we had in the Cold War was the idea, and essentially that power is balanced between maybe, let's say, two so-called superpowers at the time, and that the rest of the world is kind of falling into these two categories. They belong to the one kind of world, or they belong to the other world. And something which is kind of related to this is the idea about hegemony. So that there's one power which is maybe the most dominant in the world, and we could think about the UK empire as one of them in more recent times, and others also think about the United States as this kind of hegemon after the end of the Cold War. In a way, the idea about is that hegemons kind of create a really stable system, and that is the hegemonic stability theory. Why? Because the hegemon kind of dictates the rules of trade, diplomacy, and engagement of countries with each other. And by its kind of over-proportional power to any other player or actor in the international system, it can avoid kind of wars and the change of the system. And this kind of leads towards a situation of a more peaceful interaction between countries. Not necessarily fair, because of course the hegemon is trying to develop a system which is favoring the specific country and ensuring that it's kind of continues to be the most powerful country, but as a country of like a system of relative stability. And that has been kind of developed from a liberal perspective even further. And the idea here is that, of course, balancing is unstable, inherently unstable. And liberal hegemony is a system which is kind of perceived as better. And why is that the case? Well, a liberal hegemon doesn't really kind of try to dictate the rules unilaterally, but rather kind of develop structures which might actually benefit the hegemon itself over proportionally, at least in parts, but kind of provides the ability for other countries to participate in the system as well. And therefore kind of is not using all the power it can convey, but rather kind of shares this power by allowing other countries to participate in the international system as well. So something like the United Nations could be seen as an example for this. There is a kind of unequal power distribution, which within the United Nations, there's the Security Council with the permanent 5 members, which have more power than other countries in the United Nations. But at the same time, this kind of inequality of power might ensure the continuation of the system. And but by being useful and relatively impartial and fair in other parts, the United Nations became an important tool, not just for the P5 members or the members of the permanent members of the Security Council, but also for the rest of the world. It became an important player in conflict mediation. And we could kind of extend this idea to other international organizations, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, etc., etc. So the idea about this liberal hegemon is that the system is shaped by the hegemon, but not necessarily the individual decisions. The question here is, of course, how does this continue? And scholars like kenberry think that if the system is established enough, that leads to a situation where the system can overcome a transition from one hegemon to another, or from a hegemon to a maybe more bipolar or multipolar system, because the system in itself is the kind of the strong point of it, rather than the individual power which has kind of created it, or who has created it. The question here is very much, is that possible? Can an international system prevail over the decline of one hegemony who has kind of created it? Is it that this hegemon can be replaced by another actor within the system, or will they change the liberal system? What will kind of come after the future? And it's not clear that one or the others will develop, but we should kind of have a very close attention to this. Well, if we kind of I talked now a lot about the international system, and within this course, we talked a lot about the international system. But the question here is, of course, what do we mean? And very basically, generally, we kind of think about it as this framework, geographic framework, the kind of relationship between all the members or all the countries in the world, and this is kind of seen the international system. But we also kind of have a certain structure in it, because we actually kind of see the key actors as the nation states. And Ole Holsti has kind of developed, Professor Holsti has developed these 5 aspects of the 5 aspects of the international system, and the kind of so-called boundary, units, interactions, norms, and structures. And he said, like, these are kind of, these factors are driving the international system and the relations between the countries. And then if we kind of have this international system defined, then we kind of think about it from a structural perspective, as we have done just now in terms of the number of the great powers, the nature of their power, but also the alliances they're going into, and the state of the system overall, like, for example, a balanced system or a unipolar system or a multipolar system, etc. So the understanding of what we mean with the international system is really kind of imminent if we are thinking about this in terms of neo-realist perspective of structuring, explaining the politics of it. Having said that, and we will talk a little bit later about this, lots of scholars were kind of voicing some criticism about this very rigid understanding of the international system. Is it really kind of still up to date? Did the world change in terms of globalization, in terms of the increased power of non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, but also transnational actors like big companies like Google or Facebook or Apple or whatnot? Or is it, so the question is, have more power kind of centers emerged over time, and do we need to extend this idea, this rigid idea of the international system or not? There's a great debate here, which I don't want to go into it, but it's important for us to understand in the future developments, whether we have to be critical of this kind of very rigid understanding of the international system. I mentioned already in terms of the ideas about balancing, we can basically kind of think about 3 different forms of power structures. Unipolar is where there's a nation or a block of power, which is the most important. That is like a hegemonic global kind of relations, like the British Empire, maybe the Roman Empire, as I wrote here. We have multipolar systems where national power and alliances come up, but it's not necessarily very stable. It can shift over time, and there are kind of frequent conflicts within it. And some people would say, like, Southeast Asia is very often kind of named in this because the power structure within different countries is very close to each other. And they can, depending on like a couple of years, can actually make a big change here. Some people were also kind of thinking, and we have discussed this throughout this class, that whether the world is moving more towards, as a whole, moving more towards this kind of multipolar system, where we have maybe different kind of regions which are becoming more and more important, regional players or regional organizations, plus some of the big powers, which might either decline or kind of increase their power, and so kind of lead to a world where there are many kind of power sources. One of the what realists often see here is that this is very, very problematic, because it leads to a increased volatility in the system and an increased likelihood that wars occur. Not necessarily the biggest of wars, but at least regional wars can occur more frequently within the system. Then we have this kind of bipolar system, which has been, which is most famous for the U.S. Soviet relationship during the Cold War, Often this is hailed as a system of great stability, where we have power balancing going on, and countries are, in terms of especially modern kind of world, deterrence and nuclear weapons lead to a stable situation. And in a way, this has been true for um, this has been true for during the Cold War, but we shouldn't underestimate the risk which is involved in it, and that is that in a bipolar world, if conflict escalates beyond the level, or maybe even by accident or some kind of mistakes, the conflict will kind of lead to a military conflict in the war. Then the risk for the whole world is going up considerably, because both of these actors have nuclear weapons, and that is true. Was true during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, but also would be true if we think about a conflict between the United States and China, possibly in the future. Then we also do have two very strong military powers, which both possess nuclear weapons. And that, of course, kind of creates an extreme risk in case there is a military confrontation. And so we can see that all of these different kind of forms, unipolar, multipolar, bipolar, have their different challenges and are having some factors which lead to instability. So that is one of the unfortunate unfortunate kind of results of this stream of research, is that there is no kind of foolproof power structure which helps to kind of appease the world in large. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of liberal scholars say that the only way to come to a more peaceful world is to have an international entity, organization, whatever, which is kind of above the nation state level, which is able to mediate conflict in an effective way. I have said most of this already in the previous slides, but basically, Deutsch and Singer are really two important scholars, which, if you're interested in this stream of research, which you should read about, which focused on the idea of polarity and what it means for the stability of the international system. And we do have, of course, in a bipolar system, especially the high risk of escalation, but the low risk maybe of confrontation, which is really quite interesting and maybe at times counterintuitive. I also, something which we talked quite a bit about in this class, of course, was the idea about hegemonic and the hegemonic liberal Leviathan by kenberry. And I think the reason why I kind of bring this book up again and again is because he's thinking about the international order as something which is systemic, rather than kind of based on the actions of the individual actors. And in a way, there is the hope that this kind of international system is capable of surviving even in transition from one hegemon to another hegemon. I'm a little bit doubtful of whether this is possible, and whether the existing hegemon is willing to kind of continue the international system, and also if the incumbent hegemon is willing to take over the norms this international system has already kind of created. So these are my doubts about it. But of course, this in a way could be seen as one of the issues to solve the problem which we had with the different kind of this research on the polarity of power, because the absence of a system there is one of the key problems, and this kind of rule-based international order could be this kind of system which kind of leads to peaceful transitions and change in power structures, and maybe even kind of kind of common norms which are upheld by each country, and therefore kind of make it at least less likely, maybe even not necessary to have military conflict at all. If we kind of think further, just going away from this kind of structural perspective, we can see lots of other aspects which are really important. And the first one I want to highlight here, and that's also kind of reflected in later questions, is the idea about non-state actors or intrastate wars. So we do have, in recent decades, we have seen that interstate wars have declined. It's less and less, and also less and less humans are dying from interstate war. But we have seen an increase in interstate wars. That means like within countries, and also increased use of force by non-state actors. That can be seen at the one hand as a response to repression by states, but also seen as an increased act of political violence and terrorism, etc. So we do have these kind of different components which are important to understand. But all the systemic issues we have been talking about before were all based on this kind of interstate conflict rather than intrastate. There has been a large stream of research into this changing world from this perspective, which at the moment is not as prominent anymore than it used to be, like maybe, let's say, 5 years ago. Why is that the case? Well, because the escalation of the conflict between the United States and China has kind of taken the headlight a little bit off of this. But if we look at the decades before, trouble with terrorism in the Middle East, in Iraq with IS and Syria, etc., has kind of shown very much that this is a problem, and lots of these kind of conflicts have not been resolved. So this will continue to be a problem. Another issue is the increased amount of weapons of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, maybe more generally. And that is kind of might create additional problematic situations. The proliferation of nuclear weapons leads to an increased amount of countries holding these nuclear weapons, which from a systemic perspective also leads to a higher likelihood that they are used, but also kind of needs to be resolved what factor they have in this in the discussion about power structures, because in a way nuclear weapons are less, the kind of increase of power by nuclear weapons is less linear than it is with other forms of military equipment, and so that makes it this can kind of leads to a distortion of the power structure overall, and also kind of needs us to understand the risks and the of the possibility of use of these weapons as well. This comes in mind, of course, with the conflict around North Korea, but other actors between India, Pakistan, who are kind of acquired nuclear weapons, are kind of in the same category. Of course, the question here is really out about this kind of idea about liberal hegemon, and I have talked quite a bit in my previous slide about it. But in a way, maybe I can bury the ideas a little bit too idealistic. It seems that the United States is not really a liberal hegemon by itself, but rather a mixture of a traditional great power and the liberal hegemon. And this kind of mixture can also maybe create a situation which is problematic for justifying the liberal system, the liberal international order. And this kind of seems to be problematic, especially in the moment where China feel like, from a Chinese perspective, very often these liberal institutions are not just kind of tilted towards the hegemon who created them, the United States, but makes access for the country quite difficult. And so what we do see is that alternative organizations are built up, maybe also international organizations, liberal organizations like the AIIB, would that be an example in there? And so one challenge for the international liberal order is that maybe there are competing international orders being created. The last point here I would like to make is that for some time, we thought that liberalism and instant communication, kind of the world was becoming closer. But what we do see here and more liberal, but what we do see here that this in recent years has been challenged, and there's a real revitalization of national interests, emphasis on nationalism. We can see this in the United States. We can also see it in China, but in many countries around the world, in Europe, European countries, in the UK with Brexit, but also even here in Japan, we do see that this increased nationalistic tendencies become more prominent. And so another question and complicating factor for the future is that maybe an international liberal order is not so much a preferred outcome for many countries anymore, and therefore kind of makes it difficult as well. In the last last two kind of slides, 2 or 3 slides, I would like to kind of see like how can these kind of challenges be kind of translated into threats for the international system in the future. And the first thing is, if you kind of remember the structure of our class, is that we were talking about these kind of changes in the power structure. And we said today also that it is constantly changing, and that instability or change in the system is actually this kind of creates, or this volatility, how I called it earlier, creates some kind of the potential of conflict and even wars. And so I want you, until our class, think a little bit about what this means, like, for example, from the declining positions, power positions of Europe and Russia, whether do they pose a threat to the international system? I remember in our last presentation on Russia, this idea about declining power Russia and maybe even declining power Europe was challenged, and maybe you don't see it as declining powers at all. But generally kind of think a little bit about what does it mean if big powers are declining? Does this kind of create challenges, or does it not? Or does it really depend on maybe Europe is a challenge for the system and Russia not, or vice versa? At the same time, of course, analog, we could kind of think about the rising powers, and we can see, like, do you think China or maybe India pose a threat for the international system as we know it now, maybe the international liberal order? Is it again that it depends? Maybe a democratic system like India is easier to kind of incorporate in the international liberal order because it is closer to its domestic kind of situation, rather than an authoritarian system like China. Or how do you see the kind of development here? Or and generally, you can kind of think about declining and as well rising powers. Do you think the international liberal order, how we experience it now, is fit for taking up these kind of challenges? Or do you think it needs to change in itself? The liberal order needs to change to accommodate these kind of specific challenges. And the last part, which I also really think is interesting, is like, what kind of effect do have external factors, like, for example, the current COVID-19 pandemic, which kind of had made big changes to our lives? Does it also have has a big impact, or does it have an impact on the international system and its stability? We could think about COVID-19 is just an example, which is in our minds maybe at the moment specifically, but we could also kind of see challenges from environmental factors, etc., which play into this category, that external threats, which are not necessarily kind of coming from within the international system, but rather from outside of it. And because these questions haven't been enough, I want to kind of ask even more um, um, kind of questions around this. I will not read out every single question. You can kind of go through them yourself. But some of the issues I touched already. And the first one I really want to kind of see is that the first question, does the end of the territorial agreement mean the end of the global power politics? I think it's kind of a question about that territorial disputes by large are kind of resolved, which is not true for the South China Sea and many other and several other parts in the world, but it's less prominent than it was in the last century for most parts of the last century. So the question is that, does this really kind of change the power politics which are there? Or does it just kind of lead towards different directions? Other aspects which I think are really important, maybe goes into this, is how important is territory at all anymore? Is it still the same as before, or is it becoming less important? And something here I think to consider is, the one hand, globalization, which kind of leads to a much more interconnected, at least economic, but also cultural and maybe normative perspective on the globe. And that might make territory and kind of borders less prominent than previously. Having said that, very often in very recent development, we see that borders and national identity is revitalized and becomes actually more important again. And that might be a counter argument for this kind of development. But we could also think about the cyber world, and maybe with the cyber world, I know it's not a very good, well-defined term, but what I mean is that lots of our lives are going from this kind of the real world into the cyber world. We spend lots of time, commerce, communication, etc., online, where different rules are kind of relevant. And so the question is, does this kind of have an impact on global politics as well? And the last point here I wanted to raise is this idea about looking at international organizations, regional organizations like ASEAN or maybe the European Union, but also international organizations like the UN. How important are they? Do they play a more important role and maybe constantly increasing a role in preventing and overcoming these kind of conflictual great power politics, or are they essentially too weak to fill this function? On this last slide here, I really want to go into the ideas about what will happen in the future. And the first part, I think I mentioned earlier in one of on the earlier lectures already, and this is this idea about Huntington's idea about clash of civilizations, and where he said, like, the identity part is becoming much more important than the kind of mere territory or state part. And so so in his eyes, the world will kind of align much more in terms of civilizations and religious identities and mingle around them. And the interstate war will become less frequent, but conflict between different entities there will become more prominent. Lots of people have kind of seen some empirical evidence there in terms of the conflicts which recently happened in the Middle East. I'm not so sure whether they really fit so well this bill, but we can discuss this in class as well, whether this is the case or not. The other thing is a point I want to kind of focus on. It brings two things together. The one is that maybe we move towards a more multipolar world where more powers are having a say in the international system, and at the same time, this kind of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or maybe nuclear weapons specifically. And the idea here is that this kind of multi-assurance destruction, MAD, which often more multipolar assurance destruction, MAD, which worked quite well during the Cold War, where we had two different blocks which are kind of deterred each other from using these weapons. The question here is like, how well will this work in a more multipolar world? Is it the same? Does the nuclear weapons just lead to a level of deterrence, or does it actually just kind of increase the risk potential? And that's something which I hope we can discuss in the next class as well, and see that what you think about the risks which are involved in terms of nuclear weapons at the one hand, and then maybe kind of less prominent structures of the international system and the multipolar system where multiple conflicts could occur. The last two questions are, the last question is about the United States being replaced as a liberal hegemon, and that goes back to what I said just 2 slides ago. Is it possible that the system continues to live on? And who will replace the United States, if anybody? And will this kind of mean that it's the end of the international liberal order, or will this kind of continue to exist? And maybe we can kind of find some empirical evidence for one or the other. And then the last part is maybe here, the second last question about, do we find if conflict between China and the United States continue to increase, will we find something which is similar towards like the Cold War, where we had two kind of trading blocks which are kind of opposing each other, and we have balancing act between the two different trading blocks? Or is this a kind of a completely new system and situation, and we will not resemble anything like the Cold War during this kind of conflict? So I leave you with all of this kind of questions at the end. And I know it's unsatisfying to get more questions than answers. But at the same time, I hope this opens up our discussion in class, and we can use this to be productive. So I hope you enjoyed these kind of slides, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Until then, take care and bye-bye.